When a country centralizes banking, it concentrates an enormous amount of wealth into a single institution, works mainly to make the rich richer, and opens the government to control from foreign interests. As Bill Clinton's mentor Dr. Carroll Quigley wrote, the powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. The growth of financial capitalism made possible a centralization of world economic control and use of this power for the direct benefit of financiers and the indirect injury of all other economic groups. As Jim Marrs said, anyone seeking to prove the existence of conspiracies in America needs look no further than the origin of our present central bank. Here is a well-documented conspiracy involving the very names tied to modern secret societies. Jordan Maxwell said, "Somebody is using us. The business of banking was set up in the year 1099. An income tax form is a 1099. Who decided on that? Think about it." With institutions like IMF and World Bank, along with new union currencies like the EU euro, further consolidating and centralizing the world's banking and currencies, the amount of worldwide influence these international bankers have on world economies and politics is extraordinary. Their method of control is just like a loan shark or the mafia. Firstly, to qualify for loans, desperate nations are forced into pawning mines, railways, forests, power, or water companies. Then to pay off the loans, nations are forced to do things like ignore environmental laws, lower wages, cut back on education or health care, and privatize or sell off their resources to crooked corporations like Enron and Exxon. Whenever these poor countries cannot pay off the loans, the generous international banksters simply give new higher interest loans to pay off the old ones, further indebting and enslaving the nation. As Mayer Amschel Rothschild said, "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws." More recently, Richard McKenna, former president of Midlands Bank of England, said, "Those that create and issue the money and credit direct the policies of government and hold in their hands the destiny of the people." Alex Christopher wrote, "It is a well-known fact that international bankers have financed nations to fight against each other. Where do you think the countries get their money to buy tanks, guns, uniforms, etc., to arm their nation for war? They borrow from international bankers. International bankers have financed both sides of countries at war with each other. They don't care who wins, because while the nations are borrowing huge amounts of money to kill each other, international bankers make huge amounts on money from the interest charges that they make each nation pay. They also have the power to control the outcome of the war by simply cutting off the flow of money they lend. So under the threat of war, international bankers have used their power to gain or increase control over governments. By keeping a nation in debt, they are in a position to demand a voice in the government affairs of the nation. Another goal, which they have already achieved, is to control all the world's monetary systems." Thomas Jefferson said, "I sincerely believe that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies. If the American people ever allow the private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and the corporations that grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered." Despite Jefferson's warnings, in 1791, Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, pushed a congressional charter through to create the first Bank of the United States, which stood for 20 years, until 1811, when President James Madison and Vice President George Clinton refused to sign and renew the charter. Madison said, "History records that the money changers have used every form of abuse, intrigue, deceit, and violent means possible to maintain their control over governments by controlling the money and its issuance. Strangely enough, only 5 years later, still under Madison's presidency, in 1816, he signed the charter for the Second National Bank. Such hypocritical action raised suspicion of bribe or blackmail at work behind the scenes. In 1828, Andrew Jackson said in a speech addressing the central bankers, "You are a den of vipers and thieves. I intend to rout you out, and by the eternal God, I will rout you out. If people only understood the rank injustice of the money and banking system, there would be a revolution by morning." As president for the next 8 years, Jackson worked to abolish the federal charter of the Second Bank of the U.S. In 1835, an attempt was made on his life. The would-be assassin, Richard Lawrence, pointed 2 pistols at Jackson, pulled the triggers, and miraculously, both misfired. Jackson immediately proceeded to beat Lawrence with his cane. Lawrence would later tell police he wanted to kill Jackson because, quote, money would be more plenty for him, and that he, quote, could not rise until the president fell. He said the American government owed him a large sum of money, but Andrew Jackson was preventing him from receiving it. This is most definitely a reference to Andrew Jackson's struggles with the central bank, which was the obvious motivation for such an attempt on his life. In 1836, Jackson succeeded in abolishing the Second National Bank, stating, "The bold effort the present bank had made to control the government are but premonitions of the fate that await the American people should they be deluded into a perpetuation of this institution or the establishment of another like it." When asked on his deathbed what his life's greatest accomplishment was, Jackson replied, "I killed the bank." Fortunately, we were not deluded into the perpetuation of that Second National Bank, but unfortunately, we were tricked into the establishment of another, much worse than it. From 1837 to 1863 was a period of free banking in America during which only state-chartered banks existed and the values of silver and gold were very stable. In 1863, the Rothschild interests had succeeded in forcing a bill through Congress via their insider Treasury Secretary, Salmon P. Chase. He passed the National Banking Act, once again creating a federally chartered central bank, one with the power to print and issue paper money. At the time, President Abraham Lincoln fought against the central bankers and said, "The money power preys upon the nation in time of peace and conspires against it in times of adversity. It is more despotic than monarchy, more insolent than autocracy, more selfish than bureaucracy. I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of our country. Corporations have been enthroned, an era of corruption will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people, until the wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed." He was shot and killed a year and a half later in April 1865. From 1864 to 1913, the National Banking Act and the Civil War all but forced the majority of America's banks to become nationalized. The effort to create the third U.S. central bank began in 1873, when the Bloodline International Banking Cartel engineered the first of 3 financial panics, which they used to scare the public into accepting the Federal Reserve. Eustace Mullins wrote, "A study of the panics of 1873, 1893, and 1907 indicates that these panics were the result of the international bankers' operations in London. The public was demanding in 1908 that Congress enact legislation to prevent the recurrence of artificially induced money panics. In 1881, President Garfield was assassinated less than 4 months after taking office. He was another anti-banking establishment president who took action and spoke out against them. He was coincidentally shot and killed shortly after declaring, quote, "Whosoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce, and when you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled, one way or another, by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate." The next presidential assassination happened 20 years later when a supposed anarchist shot William McKinley twice at point-blank range. Once again, McKinley was a strong supporter of the gold standard and helped pass the Gold Standard Act of 1900, less than a year before his death. On November 22, 1910, 7 of the richest men in the world met at J.P. Morgan's personal island retreat off the coast of Georgia called Jekyll Island. The 7 men were Frank A. Vanderlip, Abraham Piet Andrew, Henry P. Davidson, Charles D. Norton, Benjamin Strong, Paul Moritz Warburg, and Nelson W. Aldrich. Behind these men stood the banking and investment interests of the Rockefellers, Rothschilds, Schiffs, Morgans, and Warburgs. The 7 Jekyll Island conspirators met for 7 days and planned a series of radical banking reforms necessary to create the Federal Reserve. When the media learned about Jekyll Island meetings, the bankers all claimed they were out duck hunting. Later in life, however, conspirator and president of New York National City Bank, Frank A. Vanderlip, admitted otherwise when he wrote, "There was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive as any conspirator. I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System." Woodrow Wilson had said of the earlier 3 financial crises that all this trouble could be averted if we appointed a committee of 6 or 7 public-spirited men like J.P. Morgan to handle the affairs of our country. And that is exactly what happened. Ralph Epperson wrote, "So the American people who had suffered through the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the battles between Andrew Jackson and the Second Bank of the United States, the Civil War, the previous panics of 1873 and 1893, and now the panic of 1907, were finally conditioned to the point of accepting the solution offered by those who had caused all of these events, the international bankers. That solution was a central bank." Jim Marrs wrote, "These men concluded not to have one central bank in the United States, but several, and they agreed that no one was to utter the words central or bank. Most important, they decided that this creation would be made to look like an official agency of the U.S. government. They called it the Federal Reserve, but it is neither federal nor a reserve. It is about as federal as Federal Express, and as much a reserve as American Indian reservations. It is a network of banks, 5 originally, now 12, headed at the New York branch, all of them privately owned, but made to appear like an official government agency. The original stockholders of the Federal Reserve were Rockefellers, Rothschilds, Warburgs, Russells, Morgans, Peabodys, and Reynolds, all Illuminati families." Fritz Springmeier wrote, "The Federal Reserve Bank of New York was controlled by 5 banks which owned 53% of its stock. These 5 banks were controlled by Nathan M. Rothschilds and Sons of London. Control over the U.S. Fed is basically control over the world's money. That fact alone shows how immense the Rothschilds' power is. If one examines who has been appointed to head the Fed and to run it, the connections of the Federal Reserve System to the Rothschilds can further be seen. Another private enterprise using the name Federal that the Rothschilds also direct is Federal Express. Anyone else might be taken to court for making their businesses sound like they are government, not the Rothschilds. It is appropriate for them to appropriate the name of Federal because, by way of MI6 via the CIA, they instruct the U.S. government. Senators are bought and paid off by their system, as investigators of the BCCI are discovering. In 1913, in an effort to pacify dissenters, the conspirators pre-planned a fake opposition to their central bank scheme. House Banking and Currency Committee Chairman Carter Glass wrote what was promoted as an alternative solution, the Federal Reserve Act. Jim Marrs wrote, "Jekyll Island planners Vanderlip and Aldrich spoke out venomously against Glass's bill, even though entire sections were identical to the Aldrich plan. It was clearly an effort to garner public support for the Glass bill by the appearance of banker opposition. the appearance of opposition by Wall Street was necessary. William McAdoo, Wilson's son-in-law, who was appointed Secretary of the Treasury, later revealed, "Bankers fought the Federal Reserve Act with the tireless energy of men fighting a forest fire. They said it was populistic, socialistic, half-baked, destructive, infantile, badly conceived, and unworkable." However, McAdoo said in interviews with these bankers, "I perceived gradually, through all the haze and smoke of controversy, that the banking world was not really as much opposed to the bill as it pretended to be." Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act on December 23, 1913, just 2 days before Christmas, with some congressmen already home for the holidays, and with the average citizen's attention clearly elsewhere. In 1913, Congressman Lindbergh warned that the Federal Reserve System establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the President signs this act, the invisible government by the monetary power will be legitimized. The new law will create inflation whenever the trusts want inflation. From now on, depressions will be scientifically created. After the bankers finished profiting from the World War, they decided to cause an economic depression in the U.S. so that they could further buy up the market, further expand government, and further control the American people. Creating booms, busts, recessions, and depressions is completely scientific when you decide the amount of money printed and circulated. As Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman said, "The Federal Reserve definitely caused the Great Depression by contracting the amount of currency in circulation by 1/3 from 1929 to 1933. Gary Allen wrote, "To think that the crash of 1929 was an accident or the result of stupidity defies all logic. The international bankers who promoted the inflationary policies and pushed the propaganda which pumped up the stock market represented too many generations of accumulated expertise to have blundered it into the Great Depression. It was the game of boom and bust, using economic crisis to consolidate political power at the top where it can be most easily controlled. The major cause of the economic collapse was the deliberately created credit inflation by the Federal Reserve. In 6 years, it had inflated the money supply by 62%, inducing market speculations and unwise investments by middle Americans who were being set up for a shearing. When the shearing came, the sheep took a realistic look at their economy and panicked. Optimism was replaced by economic despair. Despair produced a willingness to accept a major expansion of government controls over the economy." During the Depression, Congressman Louis T. McFadden was a very outspoken voice against the Federal Reserve. Regarding the Great Depression, he said, "It was not accidental. It was a carefully contrived occurrence. The international bankers sought to bring about a condition of despair here so that they might emerge as rulers of us all." In 1932, he said, "We have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks. The Federal Reserve Board has cheated the people of the United States out of enough money to pay the national debt 3 times over. This evil institution has impoverished and ruined the people of the United States, has bankrupted itself, and has practically bankrupted our government. It has done this through the defects of the law under which it operates, through the maladministration of the law by the Federal Reserve Board, and through the corrupt practices of the moneyed vultures who control it." Proceeding McFadden's activism, he received a series of death threats, and then died of food poisoning shortly after, under suspicious circumstances. President Franklin D. Roosevelt said in 1933, "The real truth of the matter is that a financial element in the large centers has owned the government since the days of Andrew Jackson." Ralph Epperson wrote, "Once inflation or deflation has been documented, the government economists point with pride at the supposed perpetrators, the public. They never direct their attention at the real culprit in America, the privately owned Federal Reserve System. This private banking establishment has complete control over the quantity of money in circulation. Therefore, they have the ability to create inflation or deflation whenever they choose to do so. Since the Great Depression, the Federal Reserve bankers have continued to manipulate the market for their own gain, and done so through periodic planned market plunges, after which they buy up all they can. In 1936 and 37, stock prices plummeted 50%. In 1948, dropped 16%. In 1953, down 13%. 1956 and 57, down 13%. And late in 57, down another 19%. It has continued like this every few years until today. In 1963, President Kennedy passed Executive Order 11110, which stripped the Federal Reserve from its power to loan money to the U.S. government. It also called for the printing of $450 billion in U.S.-backed debt-free currency, and gave the Treasury Department the authority to issue silver certificates against the Treasury's silver holdings. 6 months after this, JFK was killed. As soon as his successor Lyndon Johnson took office, the first thing he did was suspend the printing of JFK's silver certificates, and took them out of circulation. Ron Paul said, "It's money out of thin air. It's the secrecy of it all that's so bad. The ownership is by members of all the banks. It is something Congress created. The first central and national bank was created by Alexander Hamilton, and Jefferson got rid of it. The second one was gotten rid of by Andrew Jackson, and I'm just looking forward to being the president that gets rid of the third national bank." And Jordan Maxwell wrote, "Do you remember the television show called Mission Impossible? If you ever see a rerun, watch the opening of the show very closely. What will come up on the screen will be the insignia IMF, supposedly standing for the Impossible Mission Force. The Impossible Mission Force, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, what were they always doing on the show? They were always tricking leaders out of positions of authority, assassinating somebody, helping people escape, or doing some other dirty deal, all in a war for power. Whose power? Of course, they were always working for some government, but the agents are not supposed to know who that is for sure. They just do their jobs, not knowing who's really hired them. The IMF just sends them out on a mission that they must perform at all costs. And if anyone should find out who's really pulling the strings, then the agents are told that we are going to disavow any connection to you. Well, that is the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which is the power behind the Federal Reserve System, which is raping our country and destroying our economy. And these guys are doing it right in front of you, telling you what they are doing. But we just don't see it, even after they spell it out for us on television. They are even making comedies about it, like Get Smart. On one side you have chaos, and on the other you have control. And when you watch the show closely and ignore the foolishness, it is easy to see that the same operation is running both sides, creating chaos, then rushing in to control it, in order to accomplish an agenda. That is how it has always been. Get smart. They are telling you something.